Hi, I'm Bob. Welcome back to the Economics in Real Life. In the previous episode, we explored how tariffs are shared between consumers and firms. We reached an important conclusion. The share of the tariff burden is determined by the price elasticities of demand and supply. The relatively more inelastic party bears a greater portion of the tariff burden. Factors such as the availability of substitutes for the imported goods and whether they are daily necessities influence how much of the tariff burden falls on consumers. In this episode, we will explore the benefits of free trade and the social welfare laws associated with tariffs. Most countries around the world implement tariff policies at some level. Tariffs are particularly important for protecting domestic industries, especially those in their early stages of development. They help to establish a complete domestic industrial chain and reduce reliance on foreign products. However, tariffs can harm consumers. We will compare free trade and tariff policies by investigating changes in demand and supply. We will examine how social welfare is affected by tariff policies. Let's get started. All of our analyses are conducted using diagrams of demand and supply curves. The consumer's demand curve for a good and the firm's supply curve for that good are plotted on a graph where the horizontal axis represents quantity and the vertical axis represents price. Holding other factors constant, consumer demand for good generally decreases as price increases, meaning that demand and price move in opposite directions. As a result, the demand curve slopes downward. In contrast, firms increase the supply of a good as its price rises, meaning that supply and price move in the same direction, causing the supply curve to slope upward. Market equilibrium, E, is determined by the intersection of the demand and supply curves. At this equilibrium, firms sell the good at the equilibrium price P star, and consumers purchase the equilibrium quantity Q star at that price. Here are three concepts related to social welfare. Consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the most widely used measure of consumer well-being. It is the monetary difference between the maximum amount that a consumer is willing to pay and what she actually pays. Consumer surplus is a currency value measure of the extra pleasure the consumer receives from the transaction beyond its price. For example, I'm willing to pay $5 for the first ice cream. Due to the diminishing marginal utility of eating ice cream, the marginal value of the second ice cream for me is $3. I would like to pay $3 for the second ice cream. The maximum amount I'm willing to pay for the third one is only $1. Suppose the market price of the ice cream is $1. So my consumer surplus from the first ice cream is 5 minus 1 equals $4. It is the difference between the maximum amount I'm willing to pay and what I actually pay. My consumer surplus from the second ice cream is 3 minus 1 equals $2. My consumer surplus from the third ice cream is 0 because my willingness to pay equals the actual price. If I buy 3 ice creams, my total consumer surplus is the sum of the consumer surplus I get from each ice cream. 4 plus 2 plus 0 equals $6. The total consumer surplus of $6 is the extra happiness beyond what I pay. In the graph, the demand curve represents the maximum amount consumers are willing to pay. The consumer surplus is the blue area between the demand curve and the market price line. Producer surplus. Similarly, producer surplus is the additional revenue from selling a good over the minimum amount the seller is willing to produce that good. It is the difference between the minimum amount the seller is willing to supply and the price the seller actually receives in the market. The minimum amount a seller is willing to produce is usually the firm's variable cost. The supply curve represents the marginal variable cost. So, the producer surplus is the area between the market price line and the supply curve. The red area in the graph is the firm's producer surplus. Producer surplus is closely related to the firm's profit. A firm's profit equals producer surplus minus the firm's fixed costs. Social welfare. In introductory economics, social welfare is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. The government's income should be included as part of the social welfare when we discuss the effects of tariffs. So, social welfare is the total of the 3 components. We now compare the equilibrium with and without free trade in the U.S. crude oil market. Without free trade, the market equilibrium, E1, is determined by the intersection of the domestic supply curve, SD, and the demand curve, D. The equilibrium oil price is P1. Suppose the world price is PW. Under free trade, the new supply curve has a kink at the price of PW. The blue curve, S2, is the new supply curve with free trade. The first part coincides with the domestic supply curve. The second part is horizontal at the world price because crude oil starts to be imported into the country at this price, and we assume that the world supply is completely elastic. The new equilibrium, E2, occurs at the intersection between the demand curve D and the new supply curve S2. The new equilibrium oil price equals the world price PW, and the new equilibrium quantity of crude oil increases from Q1 to Q2. We can compare consumer surplus, producer surplus, and social welfare with and without free trade in the table. Without free trade, the equilibrium is E1, where consumer surplus is the area A, and producer surplus is the area B plus E. Social welfare is the sum of them. With free trade, consumer surplus increases to A plus B plus C plus D because US consumers can enjoy a relatively low oil price and purchase more quantities. Domestic producer surplus falls to E because domestic producers lose the part of sales where the price in the absence of imports is higher than the world price. Social welfare increases by the area of C plus D. It shows that free trade improves social welfare. Next, we examine the effects of tariff policy on social welfare. Suppose the US government imposes a tariff on imported crude oil, with each unit of oil levied a $T tariff. We know the market equilibrium is E2 with free trade, where the equilibrium market price is the world price PW and the equilibrium quantity is Q2. Under tariff policy, the price of imported crude oil rises by the amount of the tariff T. It becomes PW plus T. The new supply curve becomes the red curve with a king at the price of PW plus T. The upward sloping part is the domestic supply curve, and the horizontal part is for the imported oil supply. The new equilibrium E3 is the intersection of the new supply curve S3 and the demand curve D. Compared to free trade, the market equilibrium price under tariffs rises from PW to PW plus T, and the equilibrium quantity drops from Q2 to Q3. We compare consumer surplus, producer surplus, and social welfare with tariffs versus free trade. Under free trade, consumer surplus is the area A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F. Producer surplus is area G. Social welfare is the sum of them. Under the tariff policy, consumer surplus reduces to areas A and B because consumers purchase less at a higher price. The domestic producers can sell more oil because the imported oil has a higher price. Domestic producer surplus rises to C plus G. That is the area between the domestic firm's supply curve and the new price line. Domestic producer surplus increases by the area of C. The US government collects a tariff equal to the area E. The quantity of imported oil is shown in the graph. The area of E equals the per unit tariff T times the amount of imports. It is the tariff income to the government. Social welfare is the total of these three components. Tariff policy leads to social welfare laws, which is the areas of D and F. They look like two small triangles. The social welfare laws is also called the Deadweight laws in economics. Consumer welfare decreases due to the implementation of tariffs, and this reduction can be divided into two parts. First, some consumers who are willing to buy imported goods under free trade stop purchasing after the tariff is imposed. This is represented by area F in the graph. Second, consumers who continue to buy after tariffs experience a reduction in consumer surplus due to the higher price. This loss is reflected in areas C plus D plus E. Which consumer group is most affected by tariffs? In the previous episode, we discussed how tariffs are shared between sellers and consumers, with the party that has lower price elasticity bearing a greater portion of the tariff burden. For imported goods that have no close substitutes in the market, or they are basic necessities, consumers tend to bear a larger portion of the tariff burden. Low-income families are the most affected because most of their spending is on daily necessities. In contrast, high-income people have less impact from tariffs because necessities account for a smaller share of their income. Moreover, the tariff-induced price increase on the luxury goods they often purchase is tiny. Due to tariffs, the domestic producer surplus increases. The increase can be divided into two parts. Some domestic firms that were unwilling to produce under free trade start to produce because of the price increase, thereby gaining producer surplus. Domestic firms that were already in the market under free trade get more producer surplus due to the rise in market prices. A firm's profit equals its producer surplus minus fixed production costs. An increase in a domestic firm's producer surplus means its profits rise due to tariffs. Therefore, domestic producers benefit from tariffs. In addition, the government also benefits from tariffs as it collects tariff revenue. There were reasons to agree with tariff policies, such as protecting domestic industries vital to national interests and security. The policy supports newly established firms that may not yet be competitive. Tariffs can also serve as a bargaining tool in international negotiations, helping a country secure benefits in other areas. From the analysis, we can confirm two results from tariffs. First, the government increases its income through tariffs. Second, domestic firms producing the same or similar goods benefit from tariffs. Domestic firms will strongly support tariff policies. It leads to a problem: the rent-seeking behavior. Economists call efforts and expenditures to gain a profit from government actions rent-seeking. Domestic firms often use resources to lobby the government to enforce tariff policies so that the firms earn more profits. They can influence or even bribe legislators or government officials to implement tariffs, although the loss to consumers exceeds the gain to domestic producers. The domestic producers benefit from the government actions by their rent-seeking behavior. Here, the rent refers to extra benefits, like the extra producer surplus or additional profits from tariff policies. It is the area of C in the graph. If the lobby expenditures come from the rent, this extra producer surplus cannot be used for firms' reinvestment. If, unfortunately, the government's administrative costs offset all its tariff revenue, then the social welfare deadweight laws caused by tariff policies would include areas C plus D plus E plus F. That is the worst possible consequence of tariff policies. Tariff policies protect domestic producers and benefit them, but they lower consumer surplus and social welfare and may lead to rent-seeking behavior. Implementing tariff policies requires a balance of various stakeholders' interests. I just provided a brief analysis from a microeconomics perspective, focusing on consumer welfare. I hope you find it helpful, and thank you very much for watching Economics in Real Life. See you soon. Take care. Thank you for watching this video and subscribing to my YouTube channel. See you next time.